Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartia, and we are here at Open Source Summit in Vienna, Austria. And today we have two guests from the Linux Foundation, Mirko Boehm, Senior Director of Community Development at the Linux Foundation, and Cailean Osborne, Researcher at the Linux Foundation. And today we're going to talk about a new report that came out, Open Source Maturity in Europe. So before we deep dive into the report, it's great to have you both on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
It's my pleasure to host you here. Let's start with the idea behind this report. I just want to understand the grassroots reality of open source in Europe versus North America, if you can do a comparison.
Okay, well, that's not really the focus of the report we wrote, but of course, this is also kind of my background. I started as an open source contributor in the KDE community a long time ago, 97. So I grew up in a way as a open source contributor in this grassroots environment. And I found it extremely interesting, but I recognized the same disconnect that you've mentioned, that the strongly industry-backed projects are more on the other side of the pond, while we still have quite a number of very innovative, lively communities here. And many of the individual contributors live in Europe. So sometimes behind the facade of the bigger companies, the well-known names, we don't see the individuals that are doing the groundwork of contributing. And that's still a super lively community in Europe. When we do our research, we really try to capture the state of the community. We want to hear from people what their worries are, how the perception of open source changes. And basically just provide well-documented conclusions instead of just assumptions, basically.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a big difference between the US or North America and the European context is the increasing role that governments, and in particular the European Union, is playing in trying to regulate digital products that include open source software. We've seen less of that in the US.
Excellent, thank you. Now let's start with some of the basic, which is like, what was the reason behind this report? Why you folks created this report?
We have assembled this report for the third time now. It was published in 22, 23, and 24. It was called the World of Open Source Europe Spotlight Report twice, and this year we called it Open Source Maturity in Europe. And the idea behind it is to capture with both surveys and qualitative interviews, well, basically the actual state of the open source community. And to do this in a way that is interesting to the community, but also sound from a methodological perspective, as you would work as a researcher, basically. And one key aspect is, this is the report for this year, but it's supposed to be comparable to the reports from the last 2 years. So you can see trends, and sometimes that provides really interesting insights.
Yeah, and just building on what Mirko said, the purpose of the World of Open Source series, which includes the Europe Spotlights, is to really give facts to a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we talk about key trends in different parts of the world. So it's very exciting to be able to share some evidence-based conclusions on an annual basis.
Can you talk about the role that you are seeing or LF Europe is playing in bringing some of this grassroots level work to a higher level?
As we said earlier, there's a really cultural, I would say, difference between Europe and the rest of the world when it comes to open source. It's not like black and white. It's not like we do things completely different. But maybe because some of the communities emerged here from grassroots activities. For example, I feel that many of the governance norms that we think as pretty prevalent, like the separation of technical steering and project management, I've seen them first in Europe, in our communities here. And this has become something that the wider open source ecosystem has adopted successfully, and maybe today it's a driver of like how we work. And so this is just to illustrate that there are really differences in Europe, and that's an asset in a way. We should capitalize on that. And the Linux Foundation, as the largest global open source foundation, of course, caters to worldwide, first of all, to all contributors, and then to those organizations, businesses, and communities and can participate in the most forceful ways, which happens to be focused often on North America. Now, how do we strike that balance? How do we bridge this gap? If Europe has a special role to play, then we believe that it should have a dedicated organization that is able to cater to those peculiarities in a way. What's different is we have different stakeholders, or stakeholders are more engaged, like the volunteer contributor communities, the public sector stakeholders, policymakers are working with us. Policymakers are also engaging in the US, for example, but they're focusing on different topics as well, and sometimes their approaches are different. So on one hand, it is to kind of give the European community the counterpart, the organization that it deserves to support it. And on the other hand, it is to be able to reflect on those differences and, for example, work differently with the European Union compared to how you would work with the US government. So I think it's a move in the right direction, and we see a lot of interest from many participants in the open source ecosystem in collaborating in our communities.
Now let's talk about when we look at the public sector, the private sector, and then of course I also work with LF Energy, RT, Eleander. They are doing a lot of work. It's a lot of open source is being pushed there. So can you talk about what kind of collaboration are you seeing between the public sector and private sector to push some of these open source technologies or open source principle out there?
Well, the first thing that I want to highlight is that we really see a gap in adoption between private sector and public sector when it comes to open source. Open source has always been first, driven by the engineers that like the way to openly collaborate. Then it has been pushed by or adopted by companies that are building their products with it. But if you think about it, open source is a public good. It is freely licensed. Everybody can use it for any purpose. This is a perfect fit with the public sector, not primarily with policymakers, but with the agencies that provide the services to our citizens. And it's quite interesting, and for me, a bit of a contradiction, if you will, that we don't see so much collaboration there. If you think about it, every municipality all over Europe has to solve the same problem. Why don't we yet have open source software that does that? And the reasons might be in the cultures of the organizations, and the public sector works differently, it procures solutions differently, but it's something we should overcome. And that's, we're not there yet. So you asked, for example, is there a collaboration between the private and the public sector in our projects? And I can say mostly we see the private industry working together, and we see public sector getting together. And the bridges are still are not many. And that's something we want to improve. So for example, here at the event, we have a whole track on open source in the public sector, where we invited public sector speakers to share their experiences, focusing not on writing laws, but on developing and operating actual solutions.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on let's call it the public sector lag. The survey shows that there's a strong belief or consensus in the European community that the public sector has a lot to benefit from open source. Every year we ask them which sectors would benefit the most. I think number one is the IT sector, but number two is government. There is also a lot of support for the principle of public money, public code. I think over 80% of respondents said they support that principle. But then when you look at practice, it's unfortunately not as promising. There's some champions. We have the French government with Dinum. In Germany, we have Zendis and the Sovereign Tech Fund. In Denmark, you have the OS2 network at the municipal level. You have some, examples, but they are really the exception rather than the norm. In the survey, we found that 30% of respondents who worked in the public sector or previously worked in the public sector, that their public sector organization had an open source strategy, and that covers use, reuse, and contribution. And even less, 10%, said that they had an organization such as an open source program office or OSPO. So we're really, lagging behind. And so what we need to see is the translation of this excitement and maybe theory about the promise of open source to actually implementation.
I wanted to add something to that, and because people are asking, why are we, for example, pushing or promoting that organization set up in OSPO? And one reason for this is It's not that this is the only solution how you can organize open source engagement in your organization, but it shows a certain maturity of engaging with the open source community. It means that as an organization, you first think of, what are my strategic goals? Why am I doing this? Why do I want to use it or support it? And then you set this up. It takes an act act of investment, if you will, to build up such a entity within your organization. And so it showcases that you have thought of your open source strategy and that you're willing to implement it. And if you take that and then contrast it to only 30% of public sector actors have a strategy, and even fewer of them have an organizational setup like in Osborne, then it really indicates or shows that there's a lot of catch-up to be done. So that's the main conclusion we draw from this.
I also want to talk a bit about the methodology and what kind of folks you talk to for this report.
It's a combination of two aspects, two approaches. One is a survey that we run worldwide, and we had over 1,100 respondents to the survey, and 348, I think, 6, that we filtered out from Europe. And those are the quantitative insights that we have. So we ask a standardized set of questions and filter them for Europe, basically. We can contrast that this way to response from the US, for example. And the second aspect is that we did 28, I think, interviews with experts from various backgrounds, public sector, private sector, education, the open source community. And those are always, first they give more deeper insights. People can go into detail when they answer the questions, and they can be used to interpret the insights from numbers. Like, numbers tell us 82% of the respondents think public money, public code is a good principle, and the experts can tell us why people say that and what they would like to see as a result from that.
As Mirko said, we interviewed 22 people this year. We're grateful for everyone's participation, but we have to acknowledge a bias, which is that all of the interviewees are from Central and Western Europe, leaving a big gap for what's happening in Eastern Europe. So an invitation to members of the Eastern European open source community, please get in touch. We'd love to interview you for next year's Spotlight report.
Can you talk about some of the highlights in a way that you were like, hey, this was expected, you have been part of open source community, and then suddenly something, oh, that was surprising?
For me, one highlight is how many respondents say that they think that the open source development model leads to more secure software. And that they very clearly say that open source software is, they expect it to be more secure. So one is the development model and one is the resulting software. And both are very, the responses are very clearly in favor of open source. And you may be aware that this is a debate that goes on for a long time. Is proprietary software more secure than open source software? There are proponents in both directions. But my feeling is that people kind of don't buy this anymore. They say, I'm able to inspect open source software, so I know what's in there, I can find issues, and I can understand if it has vulnerabilities. With proprietary software, it's an unknown. I don't know if it's secure or not. And for a long time, this has been an open debate where pros and cons were kind of balanced. And I think from the report we hear that that's not what people think anymore. They say open source software is very likely more secure, and the development model systematically leads to more secure software. That's a real highlight for me because it relates to a debate that was ongoing for quite some time. And the other one is the strong support for the public money, public code principle. I mean, 82%, that's 4 out of 5 respondents say if public money is spent, we would like to see the outcomes openly licensed. And that's a level of agreement that it's like a very, very strong majority. Like in lawmaking, this would be an overwhelming majority. And I think policymakers should take note here. Because if this is what our constituency thinks, then maybe the average population thinks it's 70%. But that's still a very strong majority. So public money, public code as a principle, I think should become more of a guide that we follow.
Oh, I agree with Mirko that security and the support for public code, public money, public code principle are great findings. I would just add one more about open source AI. So every year we ask respondents, which technology do you think would benefit the most from being open source? And we give them a long list of technologies. And this year, machine learning and AI ranked number one with 43%. Now, the first question I ask myself is, well, that's fantastic, but what does it mean to open source machine learning and AI? And so we got the opportunity to discuss that with many subject matter experts. And now with the EU AI Act, which kicked into effect on the 1st of August 2024, subject matter experts highlighted, okay, this act, it's a regulation, it's enforced, it has exceptions, which are conditional, but for AI systems released under free and open source licenses. So then this begs the question of, okay, well, what is an AI system released under what license? And so, the Open Source Initiative, Mozilla, and also we at Linux Foundation have been attempting to answer these questions. And so at the Linux Foundation, we propose the model openness framework, which breaks models down into components, and we recommend different licenses. But basically, the EU AI Act's conditional exceptions underline the importance that we figure out what does this actually mean and what are best practices in terms of what licenses are used to distribute these components.
As you were earlier talking about, that who benefits the most from open source. When you're doing this survey, when you're talking to folks, did you also get some pushback from folks who are like, no, we don't want to use open source because it's not ready or it has these problems? Or there are folks like that, we want to use open source, but we cannot use because of this problem. Did you come across any of those cases?
Yeah, we came across the latter. So open source champions in the public sector, for example, who say, look, we need to have the mandate, we need to have the money, and we need to have the support from the top. Without those, this is not going to be sustainable, because what they're interested in is, using taxpayers' money effectively for creating software systems that serve the public interest. And so they need the mandate, the money, and the support from leadership. If they don't have that, it's very difficult to do something impactful and meaningful. So that's, just a sense of realism from practitioners.
I can add to this a little bit not from the research on the report, but from our work basically that we do as LF Europe day to day. I've been in discussions with two industry sectors. One is medical, and one is automotive, that have a difficult relationship to open source. In the medical sector, I was a bit surprised to hear that they think that open source is not professional enough. They're basically assuming that it's an ecosystem where you can get ready-made, production-ready, absolutely secure and audited solutions to integrate into the devices that they want to make. And that's not the case. That's not how open source works. You need an intermediary that takes the generic solutions that are developed by the community, and either you do this work yourself or you have somebody that does that for you to make it, production-ready. And so that's something, I think it's a perception and maybe a lack of understanding about the development model. But it hinders those folks from adopting open source because they have expectations that the community doesn't fulfill. And I don't think this is necessarily something that the community needs to fix, but we can work together to fix it. And especially in the automotive sector, but others are also showing similar symptoms. Their internal processes and their policies are still so that, for example, they find it very difficult to contribute upstream. They see risks, liability risks, or maybe a risk of disclosing ongoing research and development, where they tell their employees, their staff, no, just don't do that, don't work upstream. We consume, but we don't participate in the upstream development. This has become less. It was more 5 years ago, but it's still in place, and it's an obstacle for those organizations from leveraging open source to the best way possible, because they're just basically doing a halfway adoption and not engaging fullest, basically. Yeah.
We talked about the top decision makers. Let's talk about the grassroots level developers. what attracts them towards open source? Why they feel either, of course, market has changed a lot of, in the early days, most of us used to work in our free time on code base. Now we work for a company in the full time, we work on open source. So what motivates contributors? Did you also touch upon that aspect?
In the report, we have one finding that says when individuals initially engage with open source, they see it as a massive learning opportunity. It's their way to learn technologies. That usually happens when you're still in education or as a hobbyist if you learn something on your own device. And it's an easy way to understand how computers actually work, how software actually works. So learning and personal development is one of the key motivators. In industry, that's not in the report, but that's something I know. Developers love open source. They want to have it everywhere. It's a development environment. They want to automate things. And their open source is the easiest because you can just script the setup that you need. And that's why it's very, very much favored, I would say. Yeah. But in the report, we can say learning, personal development, that's one of the key drivers.
Another finding to build on Mirko is that, in theory, the entry barriers are very low for open source. But one thing we have heard in the interviews is that, there are actually many barriers for different people from various backgrounds. And so I just want to make a plug for an organization, Pi Ladies, which is helping women and people who, with the non-binary identification, who are mentored and shown the ropes and shown that, okay, there are different ways I can contribute to Python projects, but also beyond Python, various open source projects. And those contributions range from, helping with documentation, evangelizing a project in a new area or sector, to writing code. So there are various ways to get involved, and organizations like Pi Ladies are really showing people the way to get involved and to make it a more inclusive space.
Now, if you look at the top tier decision makers, then we look at developers, then we look at challenges as, hey, the taxpayers' money, or if the code base is secure. I feel that sometimes the OSPO kind of works as a bridge between all this, whether you are looking at internal work on open source, as you mentioned, some companies, they want to consume, but they don't want to contribute because they don't want to leak their IP, but you have to also engage with external bodies, external software. So can you talk about the role of OSPO to bring all these different components together within our organization and have a very coherent and sustainable open source strategy?
So there is not one definition of what an OSPO should do. And I think this kind of complicates the discussion. Because if I think about what an OSPO should do in like a larger company or in a public sector agency, it should help the organization utilize open source for their own strategic goals. And what those are depends on what the organization has to provide. And if you have to operate digital services for the citizens, for example, then you should be able to identify open source solutions that you want to integrate into that. And maybe you identify that with some of them you should engage in development to make sure that they fulfill all your requirements and that they are available 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This is, I think, this bridging function that you have described, supporting with strategic decision making, also explaining how the ecosystem works. Sometimes that's still necessary. And then once the strategic decisions are made, supporting with the implementation of that, with the concrete activities. Which projects do we support? Which projects do we host on our own or develop on our own? Where do we contribute? What do we need to know? How do we need to educate our staff? All these things. And that's why I said earlier that I think it's a sign of maturity, and like that the organization has gone through this thought process of saying, what do I need to do to utilize open source for my strategy? So it's not necessarily something very technical. It is actually a translation task of the strategy of the organization to the implementation where it relates to open source. And sometimes people say, well, that you don't need an OSPO for that. You can, everybody should know how to work with the open source community. That should be on everybody's portfolio. And I think that may be true, but it's a bit much to ask. If not everybody is there, that is basically like saying we shouldn't have a legal department because everybody should act according to the law. True, but most companies still have a legal department. And that's kind of this bit of a difficult decision here and a difficult discussion here. And then, of course, everybody cuts the responsibility of such a group in slightly different ways. It's not standardized, and that's why we have so many debates. But in the end, it's a translation function from the strategies of the organization to how to effectively engage and create collaboration between the open source ecosystem and your organization.
Yeah, building on what Mirko said, there's no one type of OSPO. At the Linux Foundation, we have an initiative called the To-Do Group, which facilitates collaboration between OSPOs, learning of best practices, and also does a report. And they have this saying, which is, my OSPO is not your OSPO, which is to emphasize, maybe we shouldn't focus on just on the term, but more on like the functions it has. And a metaphor I like is internal and external diplomat. And what we see in particular in non-digital native industries is that OSPOs can be a driver of cultural change. So they're not just legal experts, but maybe they organize events, where people can come along and learn about open source or spend a certain amount of time of their working day or working week, learning about it and contributing to open source. But then there are also external diplomats speaking to other organizations. And recently the UN hosted the OSPO for Good summit, which was a really interesting get-together of governments, foundations, and companies talking about how they are working together as a network. So, but another thing that the report found is that OSPOs are not a silver bullet, and they shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet. You set up an OSPO, and that's the question or problem solved. As I said earlier, they have to be given mandate, money, and support from the top.
Mirko, Cailean, thank you so much for taking time out today and not only talk about this report's, the findings, but also talk about the grassroots reality of open source development here in Europe, and also the role that LF Europe is playing in bringing the change that is needed. Thanks a lot for your time, and I would love to talk to you folks again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.